I believe it is not out of place to say that Adorno is one of the most difficult thinkers in the world. I'm sure that many a reader has thrown up his arms in frustration, thinking to himself, who can understand Adorno but Adorno himself? Adorno was allowed to take his graduation examinations a year early, which allowed him to attend the University of Frankfurt at the age of 17. Surely this is the sign of a gifted student. Adorno's friend and mentor, Siegfried Kracauer, 14 years his senior, whom he met towards the end of the First World War, took care of his theoretical education. For years, they worked on Kant's critique of pure reason. Under Krakauer's guidance, Adorno experienced the book not just as an epistemological theory, but as a kind of coded writing from which the historical condition of the spirit could be deciphered, and in which objectivism, subjectivism, ontology, and idealism were joined in battle. As Adorno himself relays, for years, Siegfried Kracauer read the critique of pure reason with me regularly on Saturday afternoons. I am not exaggerating in the slightest when I say that I owe more to this reading than to my academic teachers. If in my later reading of philosophical texts, I was not so much impressed with their unity and systematic consistency as I was concerned with the play of forces at work under the surface of every closed doctrine, it was certainly Kracauer who impelled me to do so. We can learn a lesson from this. It is not the amount of literature we read that makes us proficient, but the attention we give to reading. Focused concentration upon a solitary text often yields more rewards than a casual concentration upon several texts. It is better to read intensely than it is to read broadly. The historical context of Adorno is that of a well-educated student who would eventually come to be a kind of philosopher's philosopher. The charge that Adorno is obscurantist, simply using words in an arbitrary fashion, is false. The difficulty in reading him is that he tries to pack a great deal in a small space. I believe this is the key to understanding his prose. He tries to make several points in one sentence. He continually broadens his main point by interjecting theoretical qualifications which presuppose an intimate understanding of diverse philosophical concepts and themes. It is the fact that the reader lacks an understanding of these themes that makes Adorno so hard to comprehend. Adorno seeks to make full use of the student's knowledge. In a sense, Adorno is a well-educated student writing for well-educated students. However, his esoteric style was the natural outcome of his education, not something he tried to contrive for the sake of appearing profound. Adorno tried to be precise as well as comprehensive. He was a master of thoroughness. But in Adorno's world, with such a proficient education as his, this takes on the appearance of obtrusiveness. My own testimony is that the labor it takes to read him is worth the effort, precisely because Adorno is full of original and relevant substance, precisely because he speaks within a broad philosophical context. The reader should not be discouraged. There is indeed a high reward at the end of the verbal rainbow. Negativity is the word that explains Adorno's emphasis on philosophy. For Adorno, philosophy is the necessary act of negative critique. He believed that from the negative, one could arrive at a greater positive. And by negativity, we are not referring to a cynical spirit, but a critical mind. The only responsible philosophy, says Adorno, is one that no longer imagines that it had the absolute at its command. Indeed, philosophy must forbid the thought of it in order not to betray that thought. And at the same time, it must not bargain away anything of the emphatic concept of truth. This contradiction is philosophy's element. It defines philosophy as negative. In other words, it is the duty of the thinker to constantly stand outside his own convictions. It is the duty of the thinker to subject all positive claims to criticism. Philosophy must betray the absolute in order to critique the absolute, which is to say, in order to preserve and protect truth itself. This means philosophy is always engaged in the task of refuting the very thing it claims to discover. In this sense, the philosopher cannot rest content. He must continually repeat the task of negative critique, which is the only safe way to avoid the errors of a stale and regressive absolutism. Truth, says Adorno, is a constantly evolving constellation, not something running continuously and automatically. For Adorno, the interpreter is related to the content of truth. Because the world is constantly changing, man must continually reaffirm and revise his understanding of the world. For Adorno, revision is the act of truth. Truth is not automatic in the sense that the observer must connect the dots. As the world changes, so must change our understanding of the world. Adorno says that the very existence of philosophy lays in cogent argumentation. The thinkers of the past, he says, found their own truth in critique. Critique alone, as the unity of the problem and its arguments, not the adoption of received theses, has laid the foundation for what may be considered the productive unity of the history of philosophy. What is philosophy for Adorno? It is the act of critique. It is the act of negative argumentation. It is the act of dealing negatively with what is asserted to be absolute. The unquestioned must become the questioned. What is unidentified must become identified. It is the act of transcending positive claims to knowledge by the power of a negative methodology which unearths a greater positivity. For Adorno, even if the act of philosophy never produces something positive, the negative act itself is still considered to be an act of value. In Adorno, negativity is taken to be the highest value of philosophy, if not the very essence of philosophy itself. Philosophy should not, with foolish arrogance, says Adorno, set about collecting information and then take a position. Rather, it must unrestrictedly, without recourse to some mental refuge, experience. It must do exactly what is avoided by those who refuse to forsake the maxim that every philosophy must finally produce something positive. For Adorno, the failure to produce something positive is not a refutation of the value of the negative. a negative product does not amount to the failure of philosophy. The very existence of philosophy lays in cogent argumentation, says Adorno. That is, philosophy cannot be divorced from the act of argumentation. Argumentation is and must be part of the process of philosophy. The question then is, what do we argue against? Once again, we quote Adorno. If philosophy is still necessary, it is so only in the way it has been from time immemorial, as critique, as resistance to the expanding heteronomy. It is incumbent upon philosophy, as long as it is not prohibited, as it was in the Christianized Athens of late antiquity, to provide a refuge for freedom. Heteronomy refers to thought that is controlled or externally influenced. Adorno invokes the idea of heteronomy in contrast to autonomy. For Adorno, an autonomous thinker is one who has the ability to think against the envelopment of populism. The autonomous thinker does not merely conform to a received thesis. An autonomous thinker is one who resists the herd mentality. Instead of being taken in by the latest affirmations of culture, merely conforming to what is popular, traditional, or historical, an autonomous thinker is one who challenges the authoritarian precepts of culture. This creates a refuge from culture, a space to resist the tyranny of populism, which Adorno calls a refuge of freedom. It is the high duty of the philosopher, therefore, to provide a space where authentic freedom can live. In this sense, the act of philosophy is entirely emancipatory and revolutionary. As Adorno says, the force of thinking is the strength of resistance to what has been previously thought. The individual who thinks must take a risk, not exchange or buy anything on faith. That is the fundamental experience of the doctrine of autonomy. But all this talk of heteronomy and autonomy presupposes the preservation of the individual against the political and cultural apparatuses of conformity and control. In other words, if all men are conditioned by the culture in which they live, the philosopher is one who stands immune to the devices of manipulation. He has, to one degree or another, escaped the power of these devices. We can only ask the question, is this the power of philosophy? To emancipate the thinker from constructed reality, to recover him from the grip of social conditioning. If this is not the case, then how can the thinker proceed by means of an autonomy which he does not possess? What do we mean? We mean that a man is born into a specific society with all the values that make up that society. The question, then, is how he can escape his conditioning so as to stand outside his culture. I contend that this is indeed one of the greatest powers of philosophy. It has the power to help us transcend the normality that has been imposed upon us through mechanisms of psychological manipulation. Further, I contend with Adorno that this is the duty of the philosopher, to get outside and look within. Instead of adopting the given world, with all its assumptions and normalizations, to stand back and perform the act of critique. From whence does our autonomy proceed? It proceeds from the act of negativity. Or to be more philosophically precise, it proceeds from the act of skepticism. A negative philosophy begins with a recognition of our conditioning. It then proceeds toward a skepticism regarding cultural experience. It is this act which emancipates us from the social matrix into which we were born. Instead of assuming the validity of our values, of our experience, of the systemic relations which make up our culture, a negative philosophy teaches us to question all that seems to be self-evident and true. Just because culture was here before us, just because it is celebrated by the masses, doesn't exempt it from the charge of tyranny or error. An adequate philosophical thinking, says Adorno, is not only critical of the status quo and its reified replica in consciousness, but is equally critical of itself. The preservation of gainful knowledge depends on the negation of the very thing that claims to be the ethos of gainful knowledge itself. The dogmatic and self-confident absolute is that which must be continually transcended. Truth, then, is the act of continued revision against tyranny and error. It is the conscious unfolding of freedom, as that freedom emancipates itself from the chains it discovers. In another place, Adorno says, philosophy should be the binding commitment to non-naivety. In a world that has been thoroughly permeated by structures of the social order, a world that so overpowers every individual that scarcely any option remains but to accept it on its own terms, such naivety reproduces itself incessantly and disastrously. What people have forced upon them by a boundless apparatus, which they themselves constitute, and which they are locked into, virtually eliminates all natural elements and becomes nature to them. Philosophy must dissolve the semblance of the obvious, says Adorno, as well as the semblance of the obscure. What Adorno is getting at is that what impresses itself upon us as being immediately and obviously true from the foundation of our social experience, those cultural impressions which shape our sense of reality, it is the task of philosophy not only to resolve these desiderata, but also to probe more deeply into the obscurity of the mechanisms of control. What merely shows itself on the surface must be unearthed. It is a thinker's duty to assault every attribute of the pretense of reality, that which offers itself as normalized experience. Philosophy has to protect itself from the chatter of culture and the abracadabra of worldviews, says Adorno. It also should not imagine that specialized work in epistemological theory or whatever else prides itself on being research is actually philosophy. Philosophy that satisfies its own intention and does not childishly skip behind its own history has its lifeblood in the resistance against the common practices of today and what they serve, against the justification of what happens to be the case. For Adorno, philosophy is the act of challenging the evident and given world. For Adorno, philosophy is a kind of resistance. Adorno says, the force of resistance is the sole criterion of philosophy. This links him side by side with the work of Nietzsche. But what is it that philosophy must resist? In a word, everything. For Adorno, there is a legitimate danger not in specialized knowledge, but in the authority specialized knowledge tries to claim for itself. The invocation of science, says Adorno, of its ground rules, of the exclusive validity of the methods that science has now completely become, now constitute a surveillance authority punishing free, uncoddled, undisciplined thought and tolerating nothing of mental activity other than what has been methodologically sanctioned. Science and scholarship, the medium of autonomy, says Adorno, has degenerated into an instrument of heteronomy. In other words, when these disciplines are no longer able to step outside themselves, when they become sacred truths and dogmatic procedures, when they occupy an authoritarian status of delegitimizing valid thought, of regulating irrational and of human subservience, then they present a threat to mankind, insofar as they present a threat to freedom in the name of truth. Intellectual enterprises that once led to autonomy now serve the purpose of integrating conformity. As Adorno says, science needs the person who has not obeyed it. This can easily be said of philosophy or any other discipline. For Adorno, the world needs the person who has not obeyed it, who has not been taken in by its psychological enticements, the person who stands outside the status quo, ever ready to call out its contradictions and tyrannies in the name of humanity. But where does all this lead? What is the point of all this intensive criticism? What is the fruit of the negative dialectic, which is the term Adorno gave to his philosophy? If for Adorno, the essence of philosophy is negative critique, then what is the purpose of this critique? I believe Adorno gives us the answer in his essay, Education After Auschwitz. He says the premier demand upon all education is that Auschwitz should not happen again. Its priority before any other requirement is such that I believe I need not and should not justify it. Every debate about the ideals of education is trivial and inconsequential compared to this single ideal. Never again Auschwitz. It was the barbarism all education strives against, says Adorno. One speaks of the threat of a relapse into barbarism, but it is not a threat. Auschwitz was this relapse. And barbarism continues as long as the fundamental conditions that favored that relapse continue largely unchanged. That is the whole horror. The societal pressure still bears down, although the danger remains invisible nowadays. It drives people toward the unspeakable, which culminated on a world historical scale in Auschwitz. The premier demand upon all education, says Adorno, is that Auschwitz should not happen again. Does Auschwitz simply mean that anti-Semitism should never happen again? Must we confine this term to a specific geography are a certain race of people? Is Auschwitz merely a reference to what the Nazis did to the Jews? Are we merely talking about the genocide of a solitary people? No, my friends, we are talking about Auschwitz as a metaphor. We are talking about what Auschwitz represents in the context of the human race. It means the demonization of a class or group of people. It means the justification of systematic violence. It means the oppression of freedom through the criminalization of dissent. It means the proliferation of destructive propaganda. It means dehumanization through the apparatus of ideology. It means the negation of ourselves as a species. It signifies the end of resolution by intelligence and the beginning of resolution by violence. The whole point of philosophy, the whole point of being critical, is to ensure that nothing like this monstrosity should ever happen again. The point of philosophy is to ensure that barbarism remains relegated to the past. The point of philosophy is to prevent the regression of the species. It is to put an end to the folly of violence. And yet, in this, philosophy has failed. The philosophy of our time is at every moment in danger of lapsing into barbarism, precisely because it does not know how to be critical of itself or the culture in which it exists, precisely because it is enamored with itself. It has morphed into a vain academic show divorced from the motions of life. Today's philosophy has nothing to do with the world, and everything to do with the proliferation of abstraction. If philosophy makes use of abstraction, it should do so for the purpose of liberation, for the purpose of expanding the vitality and quality of social life. A philosophy that fails to do this, no matter how sophisticated or logically consistent within the parameters of its own concepts, cannot be a philosophy worthy of man. Adorno is correct. The societal pressure still bears down, although the danger remains invisible nowadays. We are foolish because we assume the error of the future will look like the error of the past. This is not only why tyranny fails to be detected, but also why it is so often repeated. Because it does not appear as the crude clone of previous epochs, it takes on more sophisticated and subtle forms. If we will detect the social dangers of our time, then we must learn to be critical of the moral assumptions of our time. As Adorno says, and I close with these quotes: philosophy must prove itself the most advanced consciousness, permeated with the potential of what could be different, but also a match for the power of regression, which it can transcend only after having incorporated and comprehended it. After having missed its opportunity, says Adorno, philosophy must come to know, without any mitigation, why the world, which could be paradise here and now, can become hell itself tomorrow. Such knowledge would indeed truly be philosophy. Thank you.